Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senior Fellow at the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security at the George Washington University, Ms. Jean Meserve.
Well, I never thought that I would be playing the anthem. You should be very lucky that we weren't given handheld mics, or I'd probably be doing, a Tina Turner classic for you. So consider yourself blessed. We are, of course, discussing hybrid warfare and innovation, and we have a great panel with us today. Without any further ado, let me introduce them. First of all, Admiral Manfred Nielsen. He is Deputy Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation at NATO. Also with us today, Lindsay Gorman. She's a Fellow for Emerging Technologies at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. Ken Loy is also with us. He is Chief Executive Officer of Hensoldt. And finally, Noam Persky. Noam is International Government Lead at Palantir Technology. So thank you all for being with us here today. So warfare has changed. We used to have 3 domains. It was land or sea or air, but things have evolved. We now have other domains to worry about: space, cyberspace, the online space, and it's being exploited. Recent example, on Sunday, Ukraine had its first round of presidential elections. Ukraine, of course, has been a testing ground for the Russians for all kinds of hybrid techniques. Facebook went in before the election and shut down an estimated 2,000 accounts that they judged were inauthentic and were being run by the Russians. And they saw a new technique. For the first time, they saw a Russian agent come into Ukraine and rent legitimate Facebook pages from Ukrainian citizens, which they were then using to spread disinformation. Their goal, of course, was to reduce the credibility of the election and undermine Ukraine's democratic institutions. So just one example among many that we're all familiar with. So the big question is NATO ready for this new phase of warfare? Admiral, you are the place to go. Give us the answer. Are we ready?
I think so, but there's a long way to go, I would say. You said rightly that at the last summit we decided to claim cyber as a domain. You are right. Space, it is not knocking already on our doors, but that's the challenge of and the advantage of NATO. We can align when the world is changing, we can align our efforts.
So Noam, give us a counter viewpoint here. Do you think we're ready?
Are we ready? I don't think so. I think that there's a lot to do here. Every person I talk to within the command structure, outside of it, says NATO is an organization that is being forced to change, but reluctantly. And we're looking to industry for innovation and help, and we need the innovation that exists outside of NATO. And I would challenge that what we need is innovation inside of NATO. Because as industry, we need partnership. We don't need a customer. That's not what we're looking for. So if we look at the partnerships that we have at Palantir on the commercial side with places like Airbus, where we're driving a tremendous amount of value, it's because we have a partner on the other end that's technically competent, that has a vision and an idea of the change that they want to affect, and then we can together work to make that change happen. And what we need within NATO is a similar relationship, similar competence, and not a reliance on outsourcing of innovation.
Ken, you're also in industry. Do you agree with Noam on this?
Well, Noam brings up a really interesting point. It's really about the way in which NATO and the defense departments are procuring their products. I mean, that's changed entirely because the whole cycle time has changed. The time now is, rather than we think about the big threat where the enemies have had long times to develop their technologies, the cycle times was very deliberate. Now it's much more rapid because they're applying commercial technologies for offensive ways. So we, as in the procurement side and then in the delivery side, absolutely agree with you that industry has got to provide solutions, and in order to provide solutions, we have to be a part of that procurement decisions, and that means a very strong collaboration with those who buy the products.
Lindsay, how does it look from where you sit?
No, Jean, we're not ready. And NATO isn't ready because as a society, as a group of nations that are committed to liberal values, we are not ready for the massive technological revolutions that are taking place and will take place over the next 30 to 50 years. You mentioned the Facebook example, taking down 2,000 of those fake accounts. And I'll just make 2 quick points on that to illustrate just how ready we aren't. The first is that you mentioned a new technique where Russian actors entered Ukraine and bought and rented real Facebook pages. That was in response to Facebook's own security measures. So we're going to see this more and more, this cat and mouse game when it comes to emerging technologies. The same can be said of deep fakes and synthetic audio, synthetic media. As these things get developed, more and more we're going to need to come up with solutions to counter it, and there will be a cat and mouse game that we're not fully prepared for. On a second level, those accounts were taken down by Facebook just weeks prior to the election. The Ukrainian elections have a long history of Russian influence, and this is something that we can't just address at the last minute, a week before these elections take place. So this requires a whole of government, a whole society, and an international approach, and NATO isn't ready because we aren't ready.
Before I dig deeply into what each one of you said, I want to ask you what you see as the biggest threat. I mean, there are an array of threats in this new hybrid space. Noam, you want to go first?
I think that there's a threat around our misunderstanding of new technologies like machine learning and automation. And by staying on a very high level and having kind of principled discussions here, we're missing what's actually happening on the ground, which is application of these things now, today. It's not a 30, 50-year problem that one day we're going to wake up and we're going to have AI overlords. There's a path that we're walking, and it's happening now. And so how we're applying innovation around automation to combating those problems, exactly what Lindsay's getting at here. We know these things are true, but we believe that we can tackle them in some principled way later on, instead of actually getting at the heart of it today, making the incremental improvements and tackling these things as they come.
Lindsay, biggest threat in your view?
Yes, I couldn't agree more that we need to not only tackle them as they come, but actually even before they come.
Is that possible?
I think it is possible. I think in some ways it is possible. You know, we think of emerging technologies as things that burst on the scene before we're ready for them in a moment's notice. But actually in the scientific research community where I come from, these things take years, if not decades, to develop. So we can absolutely build moral frameworks, pro-democracy frameworks into our technologies from the ground up. I mean, if you look at social media, and by the way, I think we need to expand the conversation of NATO beyond just the defense space to consider the whole threats to the whole information space. But if you look at the social media conversation, many of these business models, YouTube's algorithm that recommends content likely to go viral, Facebook's ad-based model designed to keep you on the platform, many of these business choices were deliberate business choices.
Let me challenge you just a bit, because you've mentioned deep fakes, which are out there already and getting better and better. And we're talking about video, we're talking about audio, and they are going to be indistinguishable from the real thing. We've known that's coming, and the last I heard, there's still going to be a big time lag between the time they're rolling it out and we're going to be able to identify them and respond to them.
I think yes and no. I think there are already efforts underway to try to identify
But we're
deepfakes.
behind the curve, even though we knew that technology was coming.
I think it's a natural. It's natural for the offense to be slightly ahead of the defense, and it is this cat and mouse game that we're just going to have to do our best to keep up with. The same is true in the cyber domain, just raising the bar higher and higher for an authentic deepfake or an authentic fake article to be passed as real.
Ken, biggest threat in your view?
I think it's the way in that we approach the problem. I mean, traditionally, what have we done is we've had a culture in which we would identify what the threat is, develop a set of requirements, flow those down to industry to provide a product to address that need. And now what we're looking at is instead is that the cycle time has got to be so short, is that we can't. Part of the problem is within ourselves, our own culture. right? We've got to be more quick and be able to quickly respond to the threat, respond with solutions, because that's what our enemies are doing.
Admiral, it all comes down to speed, speed, speed. That's what we're hearing over and over again.
That's true.
Can
For
the
us,
military do it?
The biggest challenge is to operate, so to execute the current operations and to adapt in the past. So we are pretty much experienced in the military environment to operate and cooperate with the classical defense industry. When we talked about capabilities in the past, we truly manned ships, airplanes, and tanks. Nowadays, we have to realize that military development, which influenced the civilian development in the past, that this situation and this model has changed. So we are not used to cooperate with the non-defense industry. We are not experienced to use artificial intelligence, big data, disruptive technologies, and so on. And therefore, I think we have to extend our network, and we need the support of these guys.
What is NATO doing to do that?
So we changed the NATO command structure. I'm the representative from Allied Command Transformation, and we are responsible in the future for warfare development. So artificial intelligence, autonomy, big data, analytics, quantum computing are not only buzzwords for us, but we are looking forward to increase our speed, and we need, once again, the support from others which are much more experienced than we. Finally, I would say our aim is not only to deliver capabilities, but also to disrupt our processes and procedures and to implement a mindset change, which is necessary to ensure that NATO can fulfill its 3 core tasks even years ahead of us.
That sounds like a tall order. How do you change the mindset in an organization that is highly bureaucratic?
So I would offer a really expensive bottle of red wine if anybody can give me a simple answer on this. But it takes, as you said, it takes years to change the mindset. And if I would have a wish-free, I would replace 1/3 of my staff officers. All of them are pretty much experienced by young people, because young people grew up with this new technology. For them, it's easy to handle. For me, I perhaps make 10% use of the capabilities of my cell phone. My son is organizing his life, and I think my granddaughter will tell me later on, why did you use paper and pencil?
Can you get those young people to come into the military, or do they want to go to work for Palantir and Hensel?
Yeah, we are in a competition. To be very frank, our problem is to get these guys, because these guys are different than many military people. We conducted last year an exercise or an event, we call it Civics, in which we invited young people in order to experiment, and believe it or not, within 3-4 weeks, they conducted 1,000 experiments. For me, it was funny. I went into the auditions. I saw a real military organization. People who look different from military, but these guys are really, really great guys. I had to learn, feed them with pizza overnight, and it works, but I think it's important to bridge the society with having access to these guys.
No?
If I can jump in on this, I realize there's people all around me here, so I'll turn around for a sec. We do compete for the same minds or for the same talent. I think it's important, though, to understand that we don't attract people to places like Palantir because we have fancy coffee machines and lots of free T-shirts. We have fancy coffee machines and lots of free T-shirts, but that's not why they actually come. We give people the opportunity to work on very hard, very important problems with other people that are bright and driven. And we give them an environment that's iterative and where they can get things into the field. That's the place, and that's why people come to us. But the same could be true of NATO or member states, right? The same could be true. The access to, I think there's a growing appreciation in younger generations now of the importance of the access to the problem, right? Working on things in a theoretical capacity is one thing, but if you give me access to the problem, that's truly interesting, and give me access to great people to do it with. And I think that in itself gives us the potential to actually attract these people into the institutions. Because for us, it's important that those people are inside and not just with us.
Lindsay, you're the key demographic they're talking about.
Yeah,
Who
well,
you go to work for military, private industry.
well, now
think
I'm
tanks, but
now I'm in neither. But actually, as a former intern of Palantir back when I was in graduate school, I can say that certainly the dry cleaning perks were a draw for me personally. And I don't think it's possible to really understate the difficulty the public sector has in courting the best and the brightest in the technology community on these resources, but also, as Noam said, in access to the problem and the speed of innovation. One of the Defense Department's hallmark initiatives, the Defense Innovation Unit, which has offices now across the country, in Silicon Valley, really was charged with this mission of getting private sector innovation into the Defense Department more rapidly. One of the problems that DoD faces is their contracts are on the time scale of half a year to even, in some cases, a decade or more. That's not the time scale of companies like Palantir and the private sector, or certainly not the time scale that eager entrepreneurs ready to become the next Mark Zuckerberg are interested in operating on. So the DoD tried to, and is still working on this initiative, the Defense Innovation Unit, to increase these, speed up the time scale using other transaction authorities in the acquisition process to make this more possible. And they've been, by some counts, fairly successful. They've issued $21 billion of grants to innovation sources. Almost 2/3 of those sources actually already did business with the Defense Department, though. So I think that underscores that the problem is not just in terms of the speed, but also in terms of the mission. And there are cultural barriers as well. I think the Army would love access to the best and the brightest in the cyber domain, but is unwilling to lax its physical fitness requirements. And lots of people in great shape here, but most cyber experts are not making the gym their #1 priority, nor perhaps should they. So I think there are going to be cultural and technical barriers to attracting the talent and keeping it.
do you want to make a quick response to that, Admiral?
Yes, of course. I think physical fitness in the military environment should be accepted, but I agree. I think we have to spend much more focus on in areas which we are not used to observe. And that's, I think, important. I learned a lot in the last couple of years, how fast industry is developing new technologies, new startups, from the very first idea till to making its fortune. Sometimes it takes only 90 days. So in this time in NATO, we will not organize our expert group, to be very honest. So I see your point, but it's really a challenge. Deputy Secretary of Secretary General told this morning, NATO is based on consensus. And to achieve a consensus at 29, this is a challenge. And NATO has implemented and introduced procedures and processes. I'm deeply convinced we will not rewrite the Bible, but we can change these processes and procedures, and that's in common. That should be of common interest.
Ken, you've worked both sides of this. You've been in the military, now you're in private industry. Is procurement in that process a big part of the problem here?
Yeah, back to the matter that we were talking about is the culture that's inculcated in these procurement agencies, the culture which is within the industry is part of our own problem. There's certainly no lack of interest or no motivation for individuals on the government side or on the industry side is to deliver these solutions. But this part of it is just the way we do things, the way we do things in industry and the way we do things in the government. So, just take for example is what Hensoldt is doing. Hensoldt has a company that's breaking away from this traditional large company of our Airbus heritage and trying to develop a culture in which we will be much more agile, much more responsive, be able to take these risks. So look at what the threat is. Right? The threats are coming much more quickly than we have traditionally been able to respond to. We're taking commercial drones, and those are out there and disrupting our air traffic right now.
Gatwick.
Absolutely, Gatwick is a perfect example. Somebody with something that they could buy at their big box store, and then go out and they can disrupt air travel. And what the industry is doing, and what our company is doing, is trying to develop a mindset and take the risks where we have got the products and solutions. We know what's going to be needed, so we can respond to those challenges as they occur. Be partners with our government counterparts.
Noam, what are the barriers to closer and better cooperation between the private sector and the military so these hybrid threats can be met more quickly?
I think back to what we've already talked about. One is competence on both sides. So inside of these institutions, technical competence. So you have an understanding of what the technology can do and what you need, and be a good partner. On the industry side, I think there's a couple of things. One is the understanding that these are institutions that want to change, but need help doing it, right? And so the willingness and the patience, it took us 10 years of work with the US Army until we became a program of record, which happened last week.
10 years?
10 years. Took 10 years from the first conversations until it actually happened and we were awarded the contract.
And what do you blame that on, by the way?
I think a defense industrial complex that doesn't like new players, institutions that are change averse, but then to their credit, the U.S. Army, it took us suing them to make this happen, but revamped their entire procurement procedures and actually become the most agile partner we have, and oftentimes more agile than a lot of commercial enterprise in their willingness to buy technology, try it in the field, and then make good decisions based on it.
Is there also a reluctance on the part of some firms, let's say in Silicon Valley, to play ball with the military and the U.S. government?
Yeah.
I mean,
look,
particularly post-Snowden.
This is a huge and really important, relevant point. I mean, we have a lot of, especially American technology companies, that consider themselves at this point kind of supranational, and are not beholden to supporting the democracies that keep them afloat. Right, that they create the conditions for which under which these institutions can exist. And so I think reminding companies of their obligations to society is incredibly important. This is not a one-sided thing where the military has to change to become attractive. I think we need to remind companies out there and people working at these companies that they are societal players. And as players that hit a certain size in society, they have certain responsibilities to the societies they operate in.
Admiral, money is often what tells the story. How much money is NATO spending when it comes to addressing the hybrid threat?
So I don't know the exact amount of money, but
proportionally, is it getting much of the pie, or is it?
It's currently perhaps a smaller part, I would say, because we are, as you said, already focused on the classical defense industry. So I think everybody is aware that we have to do more, because when we are living in an era of big data, I think it's important that this is a special threat. So these guys who are owning data in the future, they are in a big advantage before others. And that's, for me, even important.
And that's China.
Yeah, not only China, but let's think about NATO. So sharing of information, I think that's a prerequisite to be more successful, and it's a prerequisite for building trust. Look at our
And do we have the mechanisms for doing that sharing now?
Once again, mindset. We trained our intelligence people to protect data over decades, and now from one day to another they should share data. Oh my gosh, that will be a challenge. But even inside a country, what is the takeaway from all terroristic attacks in the past couple of years? The information in general was available, but it was not shared. So even in one single country, sometimes 20 different organizations hold some puzzle pieces, but we didn't put it together. And I think to make real progress, first of all, in an era of big data, you may like it or not, sharing of information, not only inside the military, is a must, not an option.
I know Noam wants to chime in.
No, I love this. This is because I think this gets to really the heart of the matter. I think in traditional intelligence, we have a history of sharing reporting, right? So you have data and information, and then you synthesize that into intelligence, and then you have somebody with a black pen that goes and redacts this to the point at which you're comfortable giving it to somebody else. And that's a process that takes time, and it's a process that doesn't respect this conception that exactly what you're describing, which is that to have a reasonable chance of combating a threat, you have to actually understand the picture. And if you don't have the data, you don't understand the picture. And at this point, no one institution in a country, no one country has the totality of the picture. So if you're not sharing data, not just sharing reporting information, but actually sharing data, there's no way to actually combat that threat. The technical capabilities exist to do this. This is not a problem from a technical perspective, but it is a mindset problem, but it's also a policy and legal problem. So the legal support for what can you share between these institutions, so between military institutions in itself is one problem, but there are threats that go across the military and civilian space. So what is an internal security service and the military intelligence service? What are they allowed to share within the country and beyond those borders? And without good regulation and work through pieces of legislation on this, people aren't comfortable to make the cultural change. And I think this is a really, really important part to unlock the ability to share data within and between countries.
Ken's going to chime in a second here, but I want to remind all of you that we want your questions, so start thinking. We have some folks from microphones who'll be running around in just a minute. Ken, did you want to chime in on the
Yeah, so if we talk also about on another aspect of information sharing is also on the command and control side, right? Is how do we share information across systems? How do we share information across borders and across the entire alliance? There's got to be standardization of the protocols. And what also we look at is also at the sensor level. Is that what we're also looking at is how can we take that same sort of methodology, the same sort of mindset of data sharing, and then fuse information from multiple sensors towards a larger purpose. So you can take one sensor which would be designed for missile warning, another one which would be designed for electronic warfare, for RF reception, and combine those into a fused picture for situational awareness. And now if we can take that protocol and we can share it across platforms, then it's going to be it's going to be an enabler for command and control across the entire enterprise.
Lindsay?
Yeah, I think on the intelligence sharing picture, as you've heard here, it is so important to the NATO alliance, the Five Eyes partnership, and that's why this matter with Huawei and 5G in the networks in Europe has a potential to be so problematic for the alliance, because it can undermine our supply chain that goes into this intelligence sharing and seriously weaken our capabilities. So that's why this conversation is extremely important, and it's extremely important to develop actual cyber risk assessments of the threat of an authoritarian regime's infrastructure in our telecommunications networks. And I'll just say also on the concept of data sharing and the importance of data moving forward, that I think as NATO transitions to an organization that is based not just on military commitments, but on values commitments, which I think you'll hear later, the importance of doubling down on our liberal values and building those into our military as well as societal processes cannot be understated. And when it comes to data sharing, authoritarian regimes have some distinct advantages. And it's not that we don't have advantages too, but we would be well advised to consider them. China can actually collect all of its data. It's from its people on its financial data, their movements, their facial recognition.
AI and all the other
and it's fueling the surveillance state and authoritarian regimes, and then China is exporting this to countries in the Belt and Road Initiative who are happy to have added security measures and don't have those same moral qualms that we do. So I think on the one hand we need to be clear on what we are okay with and what does constitute responsible use for artificial intelligence for personal data. On the other hand, we also need to bring this conversation into more actors. When we speak about Google and Microsoft and the employee protests over military contracts, I think what what they're getting at is real concerns on how the technology they're developing is being used, and this is not a new problem. Einstein and Oppenheimer felt the same way about the development of the atomic bomb. So there have always been these moral questions, and I think it's a matter of engaging constructively and hearing the other side from this big gulf of country between DC and Silicon Valley, and really trying to understand and address the concerns as opposed to maybe condescending to them as both sides are wont to do.
Questions? We have one right here. Can we bring a microphone over there?
Hello, my name is Daniel Weimer. I'm a Mercator Research Fellow working on disinformation and malicious foreign interference. So thank you very much for this very insightful conversation. So my concern is we've been talking about hybrid threats, and I feel like it's becoming some sort of melting pot term for many different threats that are actually quite different. For example, when we look at the cyber information space, I feel like the challenges we face in the very technical cyberspace are very distinct from the challenges we face in the very psychological information online environment. So I was wondering specifically for NATO whether there was any efforts in actually targeting these different threats we have with targeted, tailored solutions that also go beyond the establishment of the COE of countering hybrid threats in Helsinki. And also a short second question was, are there any efforts in actually introducing sort of regulamentations, for example, younger people to also join, for example, NATO to work on these issues, because you actually mentioned that. Thank you very much.
Admiral?
So there are no restrictions. Last summer we invited young people, university students from United States, Europe, to join us for 3 or 4 months for an internship, and it was really a great success and a benefit for all of us. You are right when we are talking about hybrid. It's a kind of melting pot, and you mentioned the EU Center of Hybrid Warfare in Helsinki. I am focused on the Centers of Excellence in Tallinn with cyber, or in Lithuania when we are talking about strategic communication. These are new areas, and I think we have to spend more time and to discuss how about the way ahead.
Right here, we have a question, I believe. Microphone? Here we go.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this conversation. I'm Steve Shapiro, Director at the Atlantic Council. I think we're touching on the edges of the problem, but it's not, in my opinion, a question of how to attract smart folks from the private sector to the government sector, because we're limiting thus the question and therefore the answers. In my opinion, the question is, what really makes for robust defense in this age? Are we, in fact, understanding the complete panoply of threats that nation states are facing? It's not merely cyber, it's real estate attacks, it's press attacks, it's political party attacks. Look what the Baltics go through on a daily basis, 24/7. So the question, once one asks that, you get to the question of mindset, and we lack the mindset. NATO's been dragged kicking and screaming into the non-kinetic age, but we're lacking the mindset to ask that big question. We have to have a whole of, not government, a whole, not of merely technology into military, but a whole of society approach, as Lindsay was pointing out, because our adversary uses everything, and we do not. So the real question is, what role does NATO play, or should NATO play, in affecting a proper mindset to the question of what really is defense, and how thus to integrate a whole of society approach, including the responsibilities of big businesses, in a manner which we haven't seen perhaps since World War II.
Ken, you want to take a bite at this?
Well, I think you bring up some really great points, and it's really broad too, right? Because it's not technology that you're just talking about. It's not just about policy that you're talking about or politics that you're talking about, but it's this really broad solution set which is required to bring to bear to the problem. You know, you've got, what is the enemy doing? The enemy is doing right now is that it is a small group of people, a small cell of people who are sitting in an apartment and they're putting together a technical solution, and they can go out and they can cause mayhem. There's not a whole lot of policy decisions that need to be made, or acquisitions decisions need to be made there. So back to the matter of is that it takes all of us to work together. It's not a flow down of requirements. It's not one think tank which is coming up with a solution which is flowed down to a technical solution which is flowed down to on and on and on. It's really a partnership that has to be done with industry and with the governments. And that's why this partnership, I think we've seen with some of the programs, talked about with Joint Strike Fighter, which was really a multinational program. Talked about FCAS, which is another program, which is where we're collaborating across nations, and where the governments are inviting industry to participate in the trade studies to understand the complexity of the problem, and then also to offer up solutions. It's not it doesn't start in only one place and then blossom out. It's got to be from every single one of us has got to contribute to the solution, and we can't just wait for a NATO or the United States to flow down with what the requirements are.
Admiral, do you want to?
So I totally agree what you said. What is threat? In the past, we thought it's kinetics. Nowadays, I think we have to understand that the roots sometimes are completely different. Let me stress an example. For instance, in the African continent, I believe the Red Cross has much more awareness about the environment than we as NATO or the military has. So I propose a kind of comprehensive approach in which not only the military, but even ministers of foreign affairs, development, and so on participate. And that's why we changed our approach in the past, in the military, and especially in NATO. We thought we can precisely predict how a future tank, airplane, or ship should look like 30 years ahead. It was a big mistake. Nowadays, we invite companies like Google, Amazon, Red Cross, think tanks, non-governmental organizations to join us, not in order to predict how a tank should look like, but what are the future trends. And I think putting these views from different angles together, this is a much better approach, and then to start, what does it mean for the military environment? And everybody who intends to participate, we name it Strategic Foresight Analysis, please join us.
We have another question over here.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Michal Miarka, I'm a NATO representative to the United Nations in New York. And just a quick comment, we sometimes don't distinguish information and knowledge. And I don't have a sense that the more information we get, the smarter we do. It seems to me, though, that NATO, as bureaucratic as it is, I can find it hard with any other organization that would be so agile and adaptive to the current environment as we actually are, including the efforts taken on the joint intel side. Somebody mentioned, Noah, I believe, that it's difficult on a home front for a number of intelligence agencies to share information. Well, outside of Five Eyes, NATO has actually done that. And for many allied services, it's been perhaps even easier to share info and knowledge and analysis between themselves than between some of their home agencies. My point is, shouldn't we think about NATO as well as the effective center of gravity or the clearinghouse or the nexus for bringing about not only information sharing, which is prerequisite, I cannot overstate its value, but that knowledge, but coming up with the knowledge of this information to the outside world.
Okay, Lindsay, you want to take?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the disinformation problem in particular is one that Ukraine and the Baltics have been dealing with for far longer than the United States and Western Europe. So there absolutely is a role for NATO and international alliances more generally in discussing best practices and figuring out how to counter these threats. Stepping beyond that, though, the role of NATO and international alliances probably cannot be understated in terms of their importance. As authoritarian regimes weaponize emerging technologies and seek to divide and conquer, which is a strategy at least as old as Napoleon, though probably much longer than that. The only way that we can be relevant and the liberal international order can remain the order that governs our part of the world is to band together and establish ourselves as innovators and as innovators who care about democratic values.
We have another question here.
Thank you all. My name is Paula Alvarez Caucedo. I'm a graduate student at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I just wanted to drill down a little bit more on something Lindsay has mentioned, but no one else has really caught on to, and it's the restraints that we are encountering, especially in cyberspace with regards to moral and ethical values. That's something that's drilled down very deeply in our societies, and we're competing with societies that don't have the same constraints. So from both the public and private sector, how can we combat this? Because it's a very important thing that our societies is not willing to change. I hope it's not willing to change. So how can we move forward and still stay ahead with societies that are not constrained in the same way? Thank you.
No?
I think it's one of, honestly, the seminal problems of our time. In an era where we believe that emerging technologies are fueled by data, how does one effectively decide to use less data but keep pace with people who are using more data? I mean, if you want to like really cook it down to the basics here. I think there is a bit of laziness in that approach, right? So one could have taken the same approach post 9/11 to saying, okay, and there were advocates for that in the U.S. that security is worth giving up our privacy for, and then we have a big debate and an ongoing conversation about the fact that if we give up our privacy and our civil liberties, as we call them in America, then what are we really trying to defend? And I think we have to kind of double down on that decision that we made at that point in time. And make it again as we move into this era of artificial intelligence fueled by data. And so we were able to solve that set of problems with good engineering, because honestly, sucking up everybody's telecoms traffic isn't keeping anybody safer. That's just lazy engineering. If you do this right, and Rob Wainwright, who recently retired from Europol, I think said this best, where that agency decided to enforce deep controls on privacy and integrity of personal data, and actually became an organization that produced way better intelligence after having done that than before, because they became stringent about their internal processes and about their data, and that ended up producing better end products. And the same holds true for the world of artificial intelligence. So there's a funny example of a self-driving car project that tested all their work, and then as soon as they moved out of their testing grounds, their car kept turning left at a certain point in time every day, and they couldn't figure out why. And it turned out that the training that they had done, the hours and hours of training that they had done, were in a certain part of Nevada where the sky was a certain tint of color, right? And so the artificial intelligence, wasn't particularly intelligence, was trained in the wrong way, ended up with the wrong result. So by not being disciplined about the data that they're using, they ended up with the wrong result. And I think there's something informative there. I'll let it go in a second.
We are almost out of time, and I want to get a quick wrap-up question. A lot of powerful, influential, smart people in this room. What is the one thing NATO can and should do right now to respond to the hybrid threat? Lindsay first, really quick.
I would say quickly, it can instill cognizance of the challenges that democracies face, as was just raised, into NATO structures.
Agile used to be a software development term. Agile really is about delivering solutions, and that's where NATO can help work within an ecosystem to deliver solutions.
Quick.
Build on what we know works. We did it for counterterror. We can do it for hybrid threat.
Sharing information and building trust.
Great. Thank you to all of you for a wonderful session. It's been great.
Thank you
to the audience for your questions.